She stepped off that train expecting a monster. The marriage contract promised her to a man described as harsh but wealthy. What she found instead was a cowboy whose first words would change everything. "I'll be kind." But kindness, she'd learned, could be the most dangerous promise of all. The steam hissed and swirled around Julie Whitmore's worn brown boots as she stepped down from the train car. Her fingers clutched a threadbare carpet bag so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Cedar Ridge Station stretched before her like a dusty promise she wasn't sure she wanted to keep. At 22, Julie had already learned that promises from men usually came with a price. This one certainly had. Marriage to a stranger in exchange for food and shelter. It wasn't love, but it was survival. The platform buzzed with afternoon travelers, ranch hands, and merchants hawking their wares. Julie scanned the crowd, her heart hammering against her ribs. According to his letters, Thomas Morrison would be easy to spot. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a hard face and harder expectations. A man who needed a wife tough enough to handle ranch life and smart enough to keep her mouth shut. His words, not hers. She'd memorized every harsh line of his correspondence during the long train ride west. "Miss Julie." The voice was softer than she expected. Julie turned to find a man approaching her with careful steps, as if she might bolt like a frightened horse. He was tall, yes, but his shoulders carried more gentleness than intimidation. His brown eyes held warmth instead of the cold calculation she'd prepared for. His hands, callous from work, twisted nervously around the brim of a worn hat. "I'm Samuel Morrison. I'll be kind to you, I promise." Julie blinked, certain she'd misheard. Kind? The word felt foreign coming from a man she'd expected to bark orders at her from day one. His letters had made it clear that kindness was a luxury he couldn't afford and wouldn't provide. Yet here he stood, nervous as a schoolboy asking a girl to dance. Something was wrong. Men like him didn't make promises about kindness unless they wanted something, and Julie had learned to be suspicious of what men wanted from her. "You're Thomas Morrison?" she asked, though she already knew the answer had to be yes. Who else would meet a mail-order bride at the train station? Samuel nodded, then seemed to catch himself, as if he'd answered too quickly. His eyes darted away from hers and back again, a flush creeping up his neck above his collar. Julie studied his face, searching for signs of the cruelty his letters had warned her to expect. Instead, she found worry lines around his eyes and a mouth that looked more used to smiling than frowning. "Let me take your bag," Samuel said, reaching for a carpet bag with the same careful movement he'd used to approach her. When her fingers brushed during the transfer, Julie noticed his hands were warm and steady. Not the cold, demanding grip she'd braced herself for. This close, she could smell soap and leather on him, not the whiskey and tobacco she'd associated with her father and his friends. Everything about this man contradicted the harsh stranger who'd written to her about needing a wife who could endure hardship without complaint. The wagon ride to his ranch passed in confused silence. Julie perched on the wooden seat beside Samuel, stealing glances at his profile while he guided the horses along the dusty road. His jaw was strong, but not cruel. His hands held the reins with gentle authority, never jerking or pulling harsh on the horses' mouths. When a rabbit darted across their path, he slowed the wagon instead of cursing at the delay. This was not the behavior of a hard man who told her in black ink that sentiment was for city folks and she needed to learn ranch ways quickly. "It's not much," Samuel said as they approached a modest house nestled between cottonwood trees. The ranch spread out around them, neat and well-maintained, but not grand. Julie had expected something larger, more imposing. The kind of place that would require a woman to work herself to the bone just to keep up. Instead, she saw a home. Flowers bloomed in boxes beneath clean windows. A porch swing moved gently in the afternoon breeze. Someone had taken care of this place, had made it welcoming rather than just functional. Inside, Samuel showed her through rooms that smelled of beeswax and fresh bread instead of the bachelor neglect his letters had described. The furniture was simple but comfortable. Books lined a shelf near the fireplace. A quilt covered the sofa in colors that spoke of patient hands and long winter evenings. This wasn't the stark, utilitarian space of a man who had written that he had no time for household comforts and expected his wife to make do with the basics. "There's a room upstairs that could be yours," Samuel said, his voice careful and respectful. Not demanding, not assuming. Julie followed him up the narrow staircase to a small bedroom with lace curtains and a window that looked out over the valley. The bed was covered with another quilt, this one in shades of blue and white. Dried lavender hung from the ceiling beams, filling the air with soft fragrance. A woman had been in this room recently. Julie was sure of it. "Did you have a wife before?" she asked, then immediately regretted the boldness of the question. Samuel's face went pale, and he looked away from her toward the window. For a moment, Julie thought he might not answer at all. When he did, his voice was thick with something that sounded like old pain. "My mother," he said finally, "she died 2 winters ago. I haven't had the heart to change anything in her room." He looked back at Julie with eyes that held more sadness than she'd expected from a man who'd written that emotional attachments were luxuries he couldn't afford. "But if you'd rather have different things, I understand. A woman should have what she needs to feel at home." At home. Julie turned the phrase over in her mind as Samuel prepared dinner for them both. He moved around the kitchen with easy familiarity, cooking not just for sustenance, but with care. He asked if she liked her meat well done and actually listened to her answer. When she offered to help, he accepted with gratitude instead of the dismissal she'd expected from a man who'd written that he preferred to handle ranch business himself and wouldn't have time to train a wife in his ways. They ate by lamplight as the sun set outside the kitchen window. Samuel asked about her journey, her family back east, her impressions of Wyoming territory. He listened to her answers with attention that made Julie feel like her words mattered to him. This was so different from his letters, where he'd made it clear that conversation would be limited to necessary ranch business, and he expected her to adapt to his routines without discussion. The evening stretched comfortable and strange between them, until Julie could no longer ignore the growing confusion in her chest. She reached into her skirt pocket and pulled out the bundle of letters that had brought her west. Samuel's face immediately changed when he saw them, the color draining from his cheeks like she'd drawn a weapon instead of worn paper. "You wrote that you were harsh," Julie said, spreading the letters on the table between them, demanding that you needed a wife who could endure hardship without complaint, that you had no patience for sentiment or soft feelings. She looked up at Samuel, whose hands had gone still on his coffee cup. "But you're nothing like these letters describe. You've been nothing but kind and gentle since I stepped off that train." Samuel stared at the letters as if they contained secrets he'd hoped never to reveal. His jaw worked silently for several seconds before he raised his eyes to meet hers. What she saw there was not the hardness she prepared for, but fear. Fear and something that looked almost like guilt. "Julie," he said, and her name sounded different in his voice than it had looked in the harsh handwriting of his correspondence. Softer, more careful. "I need to tell you something about those letters." His hands trembled slightly as he reached across the table toward the papers that had brought her to him. "The truth is, I didn't write them." Julie stared at Samuel, the marriage contract trembling in her hands. "You didn't write those letters?" Her voice came out as barely more than a whisper, but in the quiet ranch house, it might as well have been a shout. Samuel's shoulders sagged as if the weight of deception had been crushing him all day. He removed his hat, running weathered fingers through dark hair. "No, ma'am, I didn't." He gestured toward the back of the house where soft coughing echoed from behind a closed door. "That will be my brother Marcus. He's dying, Miss Julie. Consumption took hold last winter, and the doctor says he won't see another spring." The contract fluttered to the floor as Julie sank into the wooden chair beside the kitchen table. "Your brother wrote those letters? The ones that made you sound like..." She searched for words that wouldn't land. like a hard man who'd work you to the bone and expect nothing but obedience in return. Samuel's mouth twisted in a bitter smile. Marcus always had a way with words. Even sick as he is, he spins stories better than anyone I know. Used to write for newspapers back east before the sickness took him. Julie's mind reeled. The letters have been so convincing, so detailed in their description of a demanding rancher who needed a wife capable of enduring hardship without complaint. She'd steeled herself for months, preparing to submit to a harsh master in exchange for security and a roof over her head. Instead, she found this gentle man who'd offered her kindness before he'd even known her name. "Why?" she asked, looking up at Samuel, who stood fidgeting with his hat brim. Why would he do such a thing? Samuel moved to the window, staring out at the darkening prairie. Because he was watching me die a different kind of death. Loneliness, Miss Julie. After our parents passed, after the neighbors moved on to greener pastures, it's been just Marcus and me for 5 years. But Marcus, he's always been the talker, the one who could make friends in any town. Me, I'm better with cattle than conversation. He turned back to face her, and Julie saw something raw and vulnerable in his weathered features. Marcus said he couldn't stand to watch me wither away like some old bachelor, tending this ranch with no one to share with. Said when he passed, I'd have nothing left but empty rooms and regret. So he wrote letters making you sound terrible to attract? What exactly? Julie's anger was building, not just at the deception, but at her own foolishness. She traveled halfway across the country based on lies. A strong woman, Samuel said quietly. Someone who wouldn't run at the first sign of hardship. Marcus figured if I sounded difficult in the letters, only a woman with real grit would agree to come. He said, Samuel's voice caught slightly. He said I deserve someone with backbone, not someone who'd marry me just because I was agreeable. A fit of violent coughing erupted from the back room, followed by a weak voice calling out, Samuel, are you talking about me out there? Samuel glanced toward the sound, then back at Julie. Would you like to meet him? Might be you'd understand better if you heard it from Marcus himself. Julie stood, smoothing her travel-worn skirts. Part of her wanted to march straight back to that train station and demand passage back to Philadelphia. But another part, a part she wasn't ready to examine too closely, was curious about the man who'd orchestrated this elaborate deception out of love for his brother. The back room was small but clean, with medicine bottles lined up on a side table and books stacked everywhere. Marcus Morrison was clearly Samuel's brother, the same strong jaw and dark eyes. But illness had carved sharp angle from his face and left him thin as parchment. Despite his frailty, his gaze was sharp and intelligent as Julie entered. So you're the woman brave enough to answer those terrible letters, Marcus said, attempting to sit up straighter against his pillows. His voice carried the refined accent of an educated Easterner, so different from Samuel's prairie drawl. I'm the woman foolish enough to believe them, Julie replied, surprised by her own directness. Marcus laughed, which triggered another coughing fit. When it subsided, he studied her with renewed interest. Samuel said you had spirit. I can see he was right. He gestured to a chair beside the bed. Please sit. Let an old fraud explain himself. Julie perched on the edge of the chair, keeping her spine straight. I'm listening. I wrote those letters because my brother is the finest man in 3 territories, but he's about as likely to sing his own praises as a coyote is to take up ballet dancing. Marcus's eyes sparkled with mischief despite his obvious pain. Samuel's kind, hard-working, honest to a fault, and lonelier than a tumbleweed in winter. But how do you put that in a mail-order bride advertisement? The truth might have been a good place to start, Julie said, though she found her anger softening despite herself. The truth, Marcus shook his head. The truth is that Samuel Morrison would give you the shirt off his back in a blizzard and never ask for so much as a thank you. He'd work himself to death to provide for you and never raise his voice, even if you burned his dinner every night for a year. But here's what I learned from my newspaper days. Miss Julie, people don't trust things that sound too good to be true. Julie found herself leaning forward. So you made him sound harsh? I made him sound like a man who'd been hardened by frontier life, but who was honest about his expectations. I may have lied about his nature, Miss Julie, but I didn't lie about his need for you. Marcus's voice grew serious. This ranch, this life, it's meant to be shared. Samuel's been slowly disappearing into himself these past few years, and I couldn't bear to leave this world knowing I hadn't tried to find him someone to love. The simple word, love, hung in the air between them. Julie felt heat rise in her cheeks. Mr. Morrison, I came here for practical reasons. A marriage of convenience, nothing more. Did you now? Marcus's knowing smile reminded her uncomfortably of her grandmother's. Then why haven't you asked Samuel to drive you back to the station? Julie opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. Why hadn't she? The practical thing would be to demand her return fare and leave these brothers to sort out their own problems. She had enough troubles without taking on a family built on deceptions and desperate schemes. But then she remembered Samuel's face when he'd promised to be kind. The way he'd shown her to her room. That could be yours, as if her comfort mattered more than his own convenience. The dinner he'd prepared with nervous care, asking 3 times if she needed more coffee, if the beef was too tough, if she'd prefer to eat in her room if his company made her uncomfortable. I should go, Julie said, standing abruptly. This was a mistake. I'll find my own way back to town in the morning. Miss Julie. Marcus's voice stopped her at the door. Samuel's hitching up the wagon right now to take you back if that's what you want. He won't ask you to stay, won't try to convince you this could work. He's too much of a gentleman for that. But before you go, ask yourself this. When's the last time someone promised to be kind to you? Julie's throat tightened. The truth was, she couldn't remember. Her father had been distant, her stepmother cruel. The man she'd been engaged to back east had spoken of duty and propriety, but never kindness. The job she'd lost when her employer discovered she was unmarried had ended with harsh words about moral character and proper behavior. She slipped out of Marcus's room and found Samuel on the front porch, staring up at the star-scattered sky. Wagon's ready, he said without looking at her. I can drive you to the station first thing in the morning, or if you'd rather not spend the night, I can take you to Mrs. Henderson's boarding house in town. Julie studied his profile in the moonlight. What do you want, Samuel? He turned then, and she saw hope and fear warring in his expression. I want you to stay, but not because of any contract or arrangement. I want you to stay because... He took a shaky breath. Because in one afternoon, you've made this place feel more like a home than it has in years. Because watching you read to Marcus made me remember what it felt like to have family gathered around our table. And because when you smile, really smile, it's like watching the sun come up. Julie's heart hammered against her ribs. Samuel, but I won't ask you to build a life on my brother's lies, he continued. If you stay, it has to be because you want to know who I really am, not who Marcus made me sound like in those letters. The night air carried the scent of sage and distant rain. Julie wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and made her choice. I'll stay, she said quietly, but I need to know who you really are, not who your brother wanted you to be. Samuel's relief was visible even in the dim light. Fair enough. He paused, then added, but there's something else you should know about this arrangement. Julie's stomach dropped. What now? Samuel's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. The marriage contract is not exactly legal yet. We need to have the ceremony performed by Preacher Williams in town, with witnesses and all. Until then, you're not really my wife, and I have no legal claim to expect anything from you. He met her eyes directly. What I'm saying is, you're free to leave any time you choose, Miss Julie. Even after we're wed, if that's what you decide. This isn't a cage, no matter what that paper says. Julie stared at him. This man who kept surprising her with his decency. You're telling me I could change my mind tomorrow and you'd let me go? I'd drive you to the station myself and wish you well. She shook her head slowly. What kind of man gives a woman that much power over her own life? Samuel's smile was soft and genuine. The kind who hopes she'll choose to stay because she wants to, not because she has to. As they stood there on the porch with the vast Montana sky stretched above them, Julie felt something shift inside her chest. Maybe this arrangement born of deception could become something real after all. Maybe kindness was a foundation strong enough to build a life on. Well then, she said, extending her hand to shake on their agreement. I suppose we'd better get to know each other. Samuel Morrison. When he took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against her skin, Julie wondered if she was making the smartest decision of her life or the most foolish. Only time would tell. But for tonight, under the endless stars of her new home, smart seemed highly overrated. 3 weeks had passed since Julie's decision to stay, and the Morrison Ranch had settled into rhythms she'd never expected to find comforting. The morning sun slanted through the kitchen window as Julie kneaded bread dough, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. Through the open door, she could hear Samuel's voice drifting from the barn where he was gentling a new colt. Patient, encouraging words that never rose above a conversational tone, even when the young horse tested his limits. Easy now, boy. Nobody's going to hurt you here. Just take your time. Julie smiled, remembering her first week when Samuel had used almost the same tone with her. When she'd burned the biscuits 3 mornings running, he'd simply said, "Takes practice to get used to this old stove." My mother burned plenty of meals on it before she got the hang of it. When she'd struggled to milk their temperamental cow, Bessie, he'd shown her the technique with endless patience, his hands briefly covering hers to guide the motion. She's particular about her routine, but she'll warm up to you. Everything here was about patience, about giving things time to grow. So different from her life back east, where every day had been a scramble to meet someone else's demands, to prove her worth through perfect performance. Julie, Marcus's voice called from his room, followed by the now familiar sound of coughing. Could you spare a moment? She wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron and made her way to his room, where she found him propped up in bed with a book balanced on his lap. "What are you reading today?" she asked, settling into what had become her usual chair beside his bed. Marcus held up a worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets. "Poetry. Samuel thinks it's foolishness, but these old words, they help pass the time." He studied her face with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. "You look happy, Julie. Settle." Julie felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm adjusting well." "That's not what I meant, and you know it." Marcus's smile was knowing. "You light up when you hear Samuel's voice in the yard. Yesterday, I watched you through the window. You were hanging laundry, but your eyes kept finding him working with the horses. And Samuel? That boy hasn't stopped humming while he works since you arrived." "Marcus," Julie began, but he held up a thin hand. "I'm not meddling." "Well, not much." His grin was unrepentant. "I'm just saying that what started as my scheming might be turning into something real. Question is, what are you going to do about it?" Before Julie could answer, Samuel appeared in the doorway, hat in hand, his dark hair tousled from the morning's work. "Sorry to interrupt, but I was wondering if Julie might like to come to town with me today. Need supplies, and thought she might enjoy seeing more of Cedar Ridge." Julie's heart gave a little skip at the suggestion. "I like that very much." "Good." Samuel's smile was warm and genuine. "We'll leave after lunch, if that suits you." As Samuel headed back outside, Marcus chuckled softly. "That boy has been planning this trip for a week, asking me 3 times if I thought you'd want to go, worrying about whether the wagon seat would be comfortable enough, whether you'd think the town was too small and rough." He shook his head. For a man who can break horses and face down mountain lions, he sure gets nervous around one pretty woman. The wagon ride to Cedar Ridge was comfortable in a way Julie hadn't expected. Samuel had indeed made sure the seat was well cushioned, and he'd brought along a parasol to shade her from the afternoon sun. As they rolled across the prairie, he pointed out landmarks. The creek where he and Marcus had learned to fish, the meadow where their mother had gathered wildflowers, the ridge where you could see 3 counties on a clear day. It's beautiful, Julie said, meaning it. The vast open spaces that had seemed intimidating from the train window now felt full of possibility. I never imagined country like this. It can be harsh, Samuel admitted. Winters are long and cold. Summers can burn the grass to nothing. Some years the cattle get sick, or the creek runs dry, or hail destroys the crops. But then you get morning like this. He gestured at the endless blue sky, the rolling grass that moved like a green ocean in the wind. And you remember why you stay. Cedar Ridge was larger than Julie had expected. A proper main street with shops, a hotel, a church, and what looked like a schoolhouse at the far end. Samuel helped her down from the wagon with gentle hands, and Julie noticed how people watched them with curious but friendly eyes. Samuel Morrison, a woman in a crisp blue dress, approached with a warm smile. And you must be the young lady we've all been hearing about. I'm Sarah Henderson. I run the boarding house. Julie shook her offered hand. Julie Whitmore, it's a pleasure to meet you. How are you settling in at the ranch? Samuel treating you well? Mrs. Henderson's eyes twinkled with good humor, but Julie sensed genuine concern behind the question. Very well, thank you. Julie glanced at Samuel, who was suddenly fascinated by something in the distance. He's been nothing but kind. Good to hear. Samuel's one of the finest men in this territory, though he's too modest to say so himself. Mrs. Henderson patted Julie's arm. You come see me if you need anything, dear. Anything at all. As they made their way down the street, stopping at the general store and the blacksmith's, Julie noticed how people greeted Samuel with genuine warmth and respect. Children ran up to show him treasures they'd found. Women asked after Marcus's health. Men discussed cattle prices and weather with the easy familiarity of old friendship. You're well loved here, Julie observed as they loaded supplies into the wagon. Samuel shrugged, embarrassed. It's a small community. People look out for each other. It's more than that. Julie studied his profile as he secured the last of the flour sacks. Mrs. Henderson told me you helped rebuild the school after the fire last year. The blacksmith mentioned you've never charged the widow Patterson for shoeing her horse. And that little girl who showed you her doll? Her mother says you carved it for her when she was sick with fever. People help people, Samuel said simply. That's what neighbors do. It was then that Sheriff Wade approached, and Julie felt Samuel's entire posture change beside her. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of commanding presence that expected attention. His badge caught the sunlight as he tipped his hat to Julie. Afternoon, Morrison. And this must be your mail-order bride. Wade's smile was charming, but something about it made Julie uncomfortable. Tom Wade, Sheriff. Welcome to Cedar Ridge, miss. Mrs. Morrison, Julie said firmly, surprising herself with the quick claim. Wade's eyebrows rose. Married already? That was fast. We're planning the ceremony for next week, Samuel said, his voice carefully neutral. Just waiting for Preacher Williams to return from his circuit. Of course. Wade's smile never wavered, but his eyes were calculating. Well, Mrs. Morrison, I hope you'll be very happy here. Though I have to say, if you ever find ranch life too isolated, I'd be happy to show you around town. A woman of your obvious refinement might appreciate more sophisticated company from time to time. Julie felt Samuel tense beside her, but his voice remained level. That's kind of you, Sheriff, but Julie's got plenty of company at the ranch. I'm sure she does. Wade's gaze lingered on Julie in a way that made her want to step closer to Samuel. Still, the offer stands. Good day, Morrison. Ma'am. As Wade walked away, Julie noticed several townspeople watching the exchange with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. He seems... Julie searched for a diplomatic word. Like trouble, Samuel finished grimly. Wade's been sheriff for 2 years, and he's got strong ideas about how things should be run. Some folks appreciate his direct approach to law and order. And others... Samuel was quiet for a long moment. Others think he's gotten too comfortable with the power that badge gives him. The ride home was quieter, both of them lost in thought. As they crested the hill that looked down on the Morrison ranch, Julie felt something she hadn't expected, a sense of coming home. The small house with its neat garden, the barn where Samuel's horses nickered in welcome, the peaceful setting that had become dear to her in just 3 weeks. "Samuel," she said as he helped her down from the wagon, "about what Sheriff Wade said. You don't need to explain anything to me, Julie." Samuel's hands lingered at her waist for just a moment longer than necessary. "You're free to make your own friendships." "That's not what I was going to say." Julie looked up at him, noting the way the late afternoon light caught the gold flecks in his brown eyes. "I was going to say that I have all the company I need right here." Samuel's smile was soft and wondering. "Do you really mean that?" Instead of answering with words, Julie rose on her tiptoes and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek. It was meant to be a simple gesture of affection, but when Samuel turned his face slightly, their lips met instead. The kiss was brief, sweet, and entirely unexpected. When it broke apart, both were breathing a little harder. "Julie," Samuel whispered, his forehead resting against hers. "I know," she whispered back, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was agreeing to. A violent coughing fit from inside the house broke the spell, reminding them both that Marcus was waiting. But as they hurried inside with the supplies, Julie's lips still tingled with the promise of something more. That evening, as had become their custom, Julie sat beside Marcus's bed, reading aloud, while Samuel listened from the doorway. Tonight, it was one of Marcus's favorite novels. And as Julie's voice filled the room with tales of adventure and romance, she became aware of Samuel's gaze on her face. When Marcus's breathing evened out in sleep, Samuel moved quietly into the room. "You have a beautiful reading voice," he said softly. "Thank you." Julie closed the book carefully. "He seems to enjoy the stories." "So do I." Samuel's admission was quiet, almost shy. "I never learned to read as well as I should have. Marcus tried to teach me when we were boys, but I was always more interested in being outdoors." "Would you like me to teach you?" The offer surprised them both. Samuel's face lit up. "You do that?" "Of course." Julie stood, suddenly aware of how close they were in the small room, how intimate this felt with Marcus sleeping peacefully nearby. "We could start tomorrow evening, if you'd like." "I'd like that very much." Samuel reached out, his fingers just brushing hers. "Julie, Marcus stirred in his sleep, murmuring something incoherent, and the moment broke. But as Samuel walked Julie to her bedroom door, as he wished her good night with eyes that held promises neither was quite ready to voice, Julie felt the foundation of something real and lasting taking shape beneath her feet. She'd come to this ranch as a stranger fleeing a desperate situation. But somewhere in the space between Samuel's patient kindness and Marcus's loving scheming, between the rhythms of ranch life and the warmth of unexpected community, she was becoming someone new, someone who belonged here, someone who was, despite all the practical reasons that had brought her west, falling deeply and irrevocably in love. The question now was whether she was brave enough to admit it, to Samuel, to herself, and to whatever challenges might come their way. 2 days after their trip to town, Sheriff Wade arrived at the Morrison Ranch with official papers tucked under his arm and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Morning, Morrison," Wade called from his horse, not bothering to dismount. "Need to have a word with you and your bride." Samuel emerged from the barn, his jaw set. "What can I do for you, Sheriff?" "Been doing some investigating into mail-order marriages lately. Seems there's been some fraud going around. Men misrepresenting themselves to attract women." Wade's gaze found Julie on the porch. "Funny thing is, I heard some interesting stories about your arrangement." Julie's blood turned cold. Behind Wade, she noticed 2 other riders. Men she didn't recognize, but whose hard faces suggested they weren't friendly visitors. "What kind of stories?" Samuel asked, his voice carefully controlled. Wade dismounted now, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. Stories about letters that painted a very different picture of Samuel Morrison than reality. Makes a man wonder if the whole marriage contract might be built on deception. The marriage is legal, Julie said, stepping forward despite Samuel's subtle gesture for her to stay back. Is it though? Wade pulled out the papers. See, I've been corresponding with authorities back east. Turns out when a marriage is based on fraudulent representations, it can be declared void, especially when there are questions about whether the bride was properly informed about her husband's true circumstances. Samuel's hands clenched into fists. What do you want, Wade? Justice. Protection for this innocent woman who was lured here under false pretenses. Wade's smile turned predatory. I'm prepared to offer Mrs. Whitmore, because that's still her legal name, isn't it? Proper protection while this matter gets sorted out. Protection? Julie's voice rose. From what? From a man who'd deceive a woman just to get her into his bed. Wade's crude words made Samuel take a step forward, but the sheriff's hand moved to his gun. Easy there, Morrison. Wouldn't want to add salt on a lawman to your troubles. From inside the house came the sound of Marcus coughing, followed by his weakened voice. Samuel? What's going on out there? Wade's eyes glittered. Ah, yes, the dying brother. Convenient how he's too sick to testify about his part in this deception. He looked back at Julie. Ma'am, I'm offering you a chance to come to town voluntarily while we sort this legal mess out. Mrs. Henderson has a room ready for you. I'm not going anywhere, Julie said firmly. Then you're making this harder than it needs to be. Wade nodded to his men, who began to dismount. You see, I have a duty to protect the women of this county from men who'd take advantage of them. The only man taking advantage here is you. Marcus's voice called from the doorway. Despite his illness, he'd managed to dress and was leaning heavily against the doorframe, a folder of papers in his shaking hands. Wade's confidence flickered. Marcus Morrison, still interfering in your brother's business, I see. Still cleaning up messes when I see injustice. Marcus replied, though the effort of standing was clearly draining him. Especially when that injustice comes from a man who's been sniffing around Julie like a dog in heat since the day she arrived. Watch your mouth, old man. Or what? You'll arrest a dying man for speaking the truth. Marcus held up the papers. These are sworn statements, Sheriff. Testimony about every letter I wrote, every word I chose, and why I chose them. All legal and witnessed by Preacher Williams. Wade's face darkened. Doesn't change the fraud. What fraud? Julie stepped between Samuel and the sheriff, her fear transforming into anger. The fraud of a dying man trying to find happiness for his brother? The fraud of letters that described a hard life but an honest one? Or the fraud of a sheriff who thinks his badge gives him the right to any woman he wants? You don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying. Julie's voice carried across the yard. I came here expecting hardship and found kindness. I expected coldness and found warmth. If that's fraud, Sheriff Wade, then every happy marriage in the territory is built on lies. Wade's men shifted uncomfortably, clearly not expecting this kind of resistance. The law is the law, Wade insisted, but his earlier confidence was cracking. Then let's talk about law, Marcus said, pushing himself away from the doorframe despite his obvious weakness. Let's talk about a sheriff who uses his position to intimidate citizens. Let's talk about legal marriage contracts and the rights of free women to choose their own lives. You're all making a mistake, Wade said, his hand moving to his gun again. This won't end here. No, Julie said quietly, it won't. Because tomorrow, I'm going to town to speak with every woman, every family, every business owner about what happened here today. They'll learn exactly what kind of man they have for sheriff. Wade's face flushed red, and for a moment, Julie thought he might draw his weapon. But Samuel stepped up beside her, and Marcus moved closer despite his weakness. And somehow the three of them together presented a united front that even Wade wasn't ready to challenge openly. This isn't over, Wade snarled, mounting his horse. Either she comes with me willingly, or I'll have this whole arrangement declared fraudulent. Your choice, Morrison." As Wade and his men rode away, Marcus collapsed against the porch rail, his breathing labored. Samuel caught him, but Marcus waved away his concern. "I'm fine, but Julie's right. This won't end here." He looked between them with eyes bright with fever and determination. "We need to get you two legally married, and we need to do it fast, before Wade finds another way to cause trouble." Julie felt Samuel's hand find hers, steady and warm. "Then that's what we'll do," she said. Together. 3 days later, half the town of Cedar Ridge gathered in front of the church as Preacher Williams prepared for an emergency wedding ceremony. Word had spread quickly about Sheriff Wade's threats, and the community had chosen sides. Julie stood in Mrs. Henderson's parlor, adjusting the simple blue dress she'd borrowed for the occasion. Through the window, she could see Wade pacing near the church steps, his face dark with anger. "You sure about this, dear?" Mrs. Henderson asked, pinning a small wildflower in Julie's hair. "Once you speak those vows, there's no going back." "I've never been more sure of anything," Julie replied, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. Outside, Samuel waited by the church door in his best shirt, Marcus leaning heavily on his arm. Despite his illness, Marcus had insisted on being present. "Wouldn't miss seeing my scheme turn into something beautiful," he'd wheezed that morning. As Julie emerged from the boarding house, Wade stepped directly into her path. "Last chance, Julie," he said, using her first name without permission. "Come with me now, and I'll make sure you're properly taken care of. Stay with Morrison, and you'll regret it." "The only thing I regret, Sheriff Wade, is that it took me this long to see what kind of man you really are." Julie's voice carried across the gathered crowd, and several people moved closer to listen. "You don't know what you're saying. Morrison's deceived you once. He'll do it again. Samuel Morrison has never lied to me. He's shown me nothing but kindness, respect, and honest affection." Julie stepped closer to Wade, her fear replaced by righteous anger. "You, on the other hand, have tried to use your badge to intimidate, threaten, and control me since the day we met." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Wade's face flushed red. "I'm offering you protection." "From what? From a man who asks permission before kissing me? From someone who gives me choices instead of demands? From a person who sees me as a partner, not property?" Julie's voice rose. "I don't need protection from Samuel Morrison, Sheriff Wade. But every woman in this town needs protection from you." Wade's hand moved toward his gun, and the crowd tensed. But Samuel stepped forward, his own hand steady at his side. "Don't," Samuel said quietly. "This isn't worth destroying your life over." "My life?" Wade laughed bitterly. "You think you could just waltz in here with your mail-order bride and make me look like a fool? You're doing that all by yourself." Marcus called from the church steps, his voice carrying despite his weakness. He held up another folder of papers. "These are statements from 4 women in town about your unwelcome attention. Seems Julie isn't the only one who's had trouble with your idea of protection." The crowd's murmur turned hostile. Wade looked around at faces that were no longer friendly, at people who'd once supported him, now viewing him with suspicion and disgust. "This is legal," Wade shouted, pulling out his papers. "Their marriage is based on fraud." "The only fraud here," Preacher Williams said, stepping out of the church, "is a man who'd use the law to satisfy his own desires instead of protecting the people he swore to serve." Wade spun around to face new opposition. "Preacher, I've heard enough, Tom. More than enough." The preacher's voice was stern. "These 2 young people want to marry for love, and you're trying to stop them for spite. That's not justice. That's sin." The crowd began to close in around Wade, not threateningly, but with the unified disapproval of a community that had finally seen their sheriff's true nature. "Fine," Wade snarled, backing toward his horse. "Marry your lying rancher, Julie. But don't come crying to me when you realize what kind of man he really is." "I already know what kind of man he is," Julie called after him. "He's the kind who keeps his promises." As Wade mounted his horse, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. This isn't over, Morrison. Not by a long shot. But his words fell on deaf ears as the crowd turned away from him, focusing instead on the couple preparing to speak their vows. The wedding ceremony was simple but heartfelt. As Samuel slipped a plain gold band onto Julie's finger, his mother's ring, Marcus had whispered, she felt something settle into place in her chest. Not just love, though that was certainly there, but a sense of belonging she'd never experienced. When Preacher Williams pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel's kiss was gentle but sure, and the crowd erupted in cheers. But the celebration was short-lived. As the townspeople began to disperse, Marcus suddenly swayed against the church wall, his breathing labored and his face pale as parchment. "Marcus!" Samuel caught his brother as he collapsed. "I'm all right," Marcus whispered, but his eyes were growing dim. "Just tired. So very tired." Julie knelt beside them, taking Marcus's thin hand in hers. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." Marcus smiled, his eyes focusing on her face with effort. "Take care of him, Julie. He's got enough love in him for a dozen lifetimes. He just needed someone worthy of it." "I will," Julie promised, tears streaming down her cheeks. Marcus squeezed her hand weakly, then looked at Samuel. "I can go peacefully now." "You too. You're going to be just fine." As the sun set over Cedar Ridge, Marcus Morrison closed his eyes for the last time, surrounded by the love he'd helped create and the community that had rallied to protect it. Wade was gone, his threats emptied of power by the truth and the courage of those who'd stood against him. But for Samuel and Julie, the real journey was just beginning. 6 months after Marcus's peaceful passing, Julie Morrison stood on the platform of Cedar Ridge Station, watching another train pull in with a familiar hiss of steam and cloud of dust. Her hand rested on the gentle curve of her belly where new life was growing, a secret she and Samuel had discovered just last week. The morning sickness had been unmistakable, but so had Samuel's joy when she'd told him. He'd swept her into his arms and spun her around the kitchen, laughing like a boy. "Another nervous bride?" Samuel asked, joining her on the platform. He'd ridden in from the ranch specifically for this moment, knowing how Julie felt about helping other women who'd made the same brave journey she had. "Look at her," Julie murmured, watching a young woman with auburn hair step carefully down from the train, clutching a worn carpet bag just as Julie had all those months ago. "She's terrified." The woman, barely 20, by Julie's estimate, scanned the platform anxiously until a tall, sandy-haired man approached with hat in hand. Even from a distance, Julie could see his nervous smile, the gentle way he spoke to ease the young woman's fears. "Thomas Fletcher," Samuel said quietly. "Good man. Lost his wife in childbirth 2 years ago. Been raising his little daughter alone." Julie watched the interaction with experienced eyes. She could see the woman's surprise at Fletcher's kindness, the way her rigid posture slowly relaxed as he helped her to his wagon with careful consideration. "Should we introduce ourselves?" Julie asked. "Let them have their first conversation in private," Samuel suggested wisely. "But maybe we could invite them for Sunday dinner next week, once they had time to settle." Julie nodded, remembering her own overwhelming first days. The ranch had become a sanctuary, but it had taken time to feel like home. As Fletcher's wagon disappeared down the dusty main street, Julie felt Samuel's arm slip around her waist. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked softly. "Coming here? Marrying a stranger?" Julie leaned into his warmth, marveling at how solid and right it felt. "Never." "Do you regret Marcus's scheming?" "Not for a single moment." Samuel pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Though I still think you got a poor bargain. A simple rancher when you could have had anyone." Julie turned his arms, studying the face she'd grown to love so deeply. The laugh lines around his eyes had deepened in recent months, and there was a contentment in his expression that hadn't been there when they'd first met. "Samuel Morrison," she said firmly, "I got exactly what I needed. A man who keeps his promises." Speaking of promises, Samuel said, his voice taking on that shy tone he used when he was about to say something important. "I have something for you." From his vest pocket, he pulled out a small leather journal, its pages filled with his careful handwriting. "I've been practicing," he said, almost embarrassed, writing down stories about the ranch, about us, about... He gestured toward her belly. "About the family we're building. Thought maybe someday our children might like to know how their parents met." Julie opened the journal, her eyes filling with tears as she read the first entry. "Today, Julie Whitmore stepped off the train, and my life began." "Oh, Samuel," she whispered. "Marcus always said stories matter," Samuel continued. "Said they're how we remember what's important, how we pass love from one generation to the next." He touched her cheek gently. "I want our story remembered." As they walked back toward the wagon, Julie clutched the journal to her chest. Around them, Cedar Ridge bustled with afternoon activity, children playing in the street, women hanging laundry, men discussing the weather and crop prices. It was a good community, a place where love could grow and flourish. The schoolhouse at the end of Main Street had been rebuilt even better than before, and Julie had been teaching there twice a week since winter ended. She loved watching young minds discover the magic of reading, the way stories could transport them beyond the boundaries of their small town. "Samuel," she said as he helped her up onto the wagon seat, "do you remember what you promised me that first day? That I'd be kind. You've been more than kind. You've been everything I never dared to hope for." Samuel gathered the reins, then turned to look at her with eyes full of love and wonder. "And you, Julie Morrison, have been the answer to prayers I didn't know how to pray." As they drove toward home, their home, the setting sun painted the prairie in shades of gold and amber. Behind them, the train whistle echoed across the landscape, carrying new dreams and possibilities toward other waiting hearts. Julie rested her hand on her belly and smiled, thinking of the life growing there, of the stories they would tell, of the love that would continue long after they were gone. She'd come to Montana expecting survival and found so much more. She found home. She found family. She found a love built on the strongest foundation of all, the simple, revolutionary promise that kindness, true kindness, was not just enough, but everything. In the distance, smoke rose from their chimney where dinner waited, where Marcus's empty chair sat as a reminder of the love that had brought them together, and where tomorrow would bring new adventures for the Morrison family. The cowboy had kept his promise, and in return, Julie had given him her heart, her future, and the promise that love, real love, would always find a way to grow, even in the hardest ground.